Part 1. The Stone Age. It's nighttime in Africa. There's no light bulb, no city, no phone to scroll. Just wind, darkness, and the sound of something growling in the tall grass. A few people are sitting around a fire. Their clothes are made of dead animals. Their feet are cracked, and their biggest dream right now is not getting eaten. These folks are your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents. Around 100,000 years ago, this is how humans lived. Cold, nervous, and very, very fragile. But here's the thing. Even though they were just trying to stay alive, they were doing something huge. They were keeping a fire going. Not just lighting it, keeping it alive all night. That little flame was more than just warmth. It scared off animals. It made meat safer to eat. And it gave people something to stare at so they wouldn't lose their minds in the pitch black. Fire was the first technology that actually mattered. And somehow humans figured out how to keep it from going out. That was our first win as a species. And yeah, it kind of changed everything. The first migration. So humans lived in Africa for a long time. They had sharp rocks, good legs, and terrible odds. They hunted animals, gathered berries, and did their best not to die of something ridiculous, like drinking swamp water. Then, about 60,000 years ago, a group of people just left. No planes, no luggage, no idea what they were doing. They walked out of Africa and didn't come back. They crossed deserts and mountains and freezing cold valleys. They saw animals no humans had ever seen before. Giant hyenas, woolly rhinos, and a few things that looked like dinosaurs but definitely weren't. Why did they go? Maybe food was running out. Maybe a fight broke out and somebody said, "I'm leaving and never coming back." And now it's a matter of principle. Either way, they walked. And here's why that matters. If those early humans hadn't wandered off, nobody in Europe, Asia, or America would exist. We'd all still be packed into one continent, fighting over the last squirrel. These travelers were the original backpackers, only without backpacks, or shoes, or maps, meeting other humans. Here's where it gets weird. When those early humans reached new lands, they found other people. Not exactly like us, close, but not quite. In Europe, they ran into Neanderthals. These guys were shorter, stronger, and probably looked like the gym rats of the Stone Age. Big bones, thick brows, and terrible posture. In Asia, they met someone even more mysterious, the Denisovans. Scientists didn't even know they existed until a few bones turned up in a Siberian cave, and it was only a tooth and a part of a finger. Sometimes they fought, sometimes they ignored each other, and sometimes they got cozy. That's right, some modern humans today have little bits of Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA. So yeah, you might be part caveman. So if you can breathe at high altitudes or nap in the cold, thank the ancient mountain guy. Learning to talk and imagine. So for a long time, humans were just surviving. Same routine. Wake up, walk around, look for food. Try not to freeze. Then around 40,000 years ago, something snapped, or clicked, or maybe sparked. Whatever it was, something in our brains flipped. From just survive to let's draw a bison and argue about it. Humans began painting animals on cave walls. They carved tiny statues, made music with bird bones, and probably invented the first off-key love song. This is what scientists call the cognitive revolution, which is just a fancy way of saying humans got weird and it worked. We started imagining things that didn't exist, or did they? Gods, ghosts, future plans, stories, and talking got better too. Not just, food, but full-on gossip. With language, people could organize hunts, tell bedtime stories, or start drama. That's how humans went from just another primate to top of the food chain with a weird sense of humor. Humans move across the earth. By now, humans had fire, brains, and gossip. So what did they do? They walked even more. They spread out across the world. They reached Australia before they invented farming. Then came the big one, America. About 20,000 years ago, during the Ice Age, there was a bridge made of ice and land between Russia and Alaska. It was called Beringia. People just walked across it. No idea they were entering a whole new continent. In the north, they hunted mammoths. In the south, they chased giant sloths. Yes, there were car-sized sloths. And yes, we hunted them into extinction. Because of course we did. In the Arctic, humans built houses out of snow and wore coats made from seals. In the jungle, they made blowpipes and slowly learned which bugs didn't want to kill them. Basically, humans learned how to survive anywhere. The big melt and the first big idea. Then the planet started getting warmer. The ice melted, sea levels rose, the weather changed. That was good news for fish, bad news for giant animals. Like Manny and Diego, their families gone. Most things over the size of a minivan were gone. Hunters had a big problem. Less food meant more hungry people. But in a spot we now call the Fertile Crescent, the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, someone got his eureka moment. Some clever person noticed that seeds dropped on the ground would grow into plants. And instead of saying, cool, and moving on, they stayed, and they planted more. And just like that, farming. No more chasing dinner. Now, dinner grew right next to your house. The first farmers. With farming, people could settle down. They built villages, mud huts, stone walls. Jericho was one of the first towns. It had a stone tower and everything. Pretty impressive for people who didn't even have metal yet. But farming wasn't easy. It meant digging, planting, watering, and waiting. And if the weather didn't cooperate, people starved. Progress. Still, it was better than running after mammoths all day. Farms led to more food. More food meant more babies. More babies meant chaos. Now you needed rules, leaders, people to say, hey, don't steal his goat. Also, not everyone had to farm. Some made pots, some made tools. Some figured out it was easier to give orders than dig holes. Society was being born, and just like a real baby, it was loud, chaotic, and occasionally violent. The first steps towards civilizations. Humans started building systems. They made rules, dug canals, and prayed to the sky for rain. They didn't just live in nature anymore, they tried to control it. And it kind of worked. People worshipped river gods, buried their dead with beads, built fences, drew lines, and immediately fought over them. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were building systems and finding new people to blame when they broke. This is what we call civilization. And this was just a warm-up. In the next part, we'll meet the people who took it to the next level, with cities, kings, writing, war, and way too many taxes. You won't want to miss it, unless you're a mammoth. In which case, sorry, your part is over. The first cities. Many of these early cities popped up in a place called Mesopotamia. That's just a fancy word for land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, to be exact. It's in the Middle East, where Iraq is today. The land was perfect for growing food, but the rivers had one small problem. They were completely insane. Sometimes they'd flood and destroy everything. Other times they'd dry up and leave people begging the sky for rain. Total mood swings. So the people living there had to figure out how to deal with that, fast. And somehow, they did. Mesopotamia and the rise of Sumer. The answer came slowly but clearly. Humans started building systems. They started digging irrigation canals to control where the water went. They built mud walls around their farms so floods wouldn't wash away their food every spring. And it worked. When people aren't starving, they suddenly have time to do weird things like make clay pots, worship invisible sky beings, or become kings. One of the first real cities was called Uruk. Around 3200 BC, this place had over 40,000 people. That's a lot of sweaty humans packed into one mud brick maze. In the middle of the city was a giant tower made of, well, more mud. It was called a ziggurat, a big layered building that people thought led up to the gods. Basically a divine staircase that no one dared to climb, but everyone paid taxes to maintain. The farmers grew food. The priests blessed the food. The potters made pots to hold the food. And the kings, they took the credit. Teamwork. Inventing the wheel and writing. Now, the Sumerians. The people who lived in these cities were kind of brilliant. They invented one of the most important tools ever, the wheel. But here's the twist. The first wheels weren't for wagons. They were for pottery. Someone wanted to spin clay faster and thought, what if I spin it on a stick? Boom. Wheel. Eventually, someone else had the genius idea to put wheels on carts and use them to move heavy stuff, like grain, or people, or war supplies. The usual. The most revolutionary invention wasn't round, it was square. A square clay tablet, to be exact. See, life was getting complicated. People had jobs, taxes, markets, and goats. Too many goats. You couldn't just remember everything anymore. So they invented writing. It started simple. Just marks in wet clay to show how many cows someone owed. But over time, those marks turned into symbols, then words, then sentences. They called it cuneiform, which means wedge-shaped writing, because they used sharp sticks to poke little triangles into clay. High-tech stuff. For the first time, people could record ideas, history, laws, bad poetry, the works. The world's first stories. Once people learned to write, they didn't just use it for cow math. They started telling stories. One of the oldest surviving stories in the world is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. It has conquest, divine drama, fear of death. Classic king stuff. Gilgamesh wasn't a superhero. He cried, he failed, he made dumb choices, which honestly makes him kind of relatable. But here's something even cooler. The first named author in history was a woman. Her name was Enheduanna. She lived around 23,000 BC. She was a priestess and a poet. and she wrote hymns to the gods. Her words were carved into clay tablets. And guess what? We still have them. So the first person we know by name wasn't a warrior or a king. It was a writer. Cities and wars. Here's the downside of cities. Once you have stuff like food, tools, shiny decorations, someone else wants it. So the early cities started building armies. The city-states of Lagash, and Umma constantly fought over land and water. One of the first documented wars was between Lagash and Umma over a canal. Not a palace, not a treasure. A ditch. In southern Mesopotamia, water was everything. You see, the land was dry, and rain wasn't dependable. So people built canals. Long, narrow ditches carved by hand to bring river water to their fields. These canals turned dust into wheat, and wheat into bread. Without them, entire cities would starve. That's why one canal between the cities of Lagash and Umma became the center of one of the first recorded wars in history. Both cities depended on it. Lagash claimed they had built it. Umma claimed they needed it just as much. And when arguments turned to threats, the two sides went to war. Eventually, Lagash won the battle and carved their victory into stone for everyone to admire. Or roll their eyes at. And just like that, kings began acting more like generals. They built weapons out of bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that was strong enough to slice through your neighbor's fancy new sandals. Or, neck. If you're wondering how kings kept people in line, the answer is easy. Fear, religion, and taxes. The original power trio. Some things never change. Egypt and the pyramids. While Mesopotamia was making muddy temples and yelling about canals, Egypt was quietly becoming a powerhouse. The Nile River flooded like clockwork. Every year, like a reliable old calendar, it spilled over and dropped fresh black soil all over the farmland. No guesswork, just plant, harvest, and thank the gods for doing their job. So Egypt got rich. And when kings get rich, they build pyramids. The biggest one, built for Pharaoh Khufu around 2500 BC, was made from 2.3 million stone blocks. Each block weighed as much as an SUV. And they moved them without wheels, cranes, or a single robot. People used to say slaves built them, but now most experts think they were seasonal workers, farmers who had nothing else to do when the Nile flooded. They were paid in bread and beer, which, frankly, is still better than unpaid internships years later. Indus Valley Civilization. While Mesopotamia and Egypt were showing off, the Indus Valley Civilization was being quietly brilliant. They built cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, with straight roads, standardized bricks, and the world's first sewer systems. Their homes had bathrooms, actual bathrooms, with drains, in 2500 BC. Meanwhile, Europeans were still figuring out that rivers probably shouldn't double as bathrooms. Their cities didn't have big temples or statues of kings, which is weird. It's like they cared more about hygiene than power. Honestly, hard to argue. But the downside is we can't read their writing. They left behind tiny stone seals with animals and symbols, but no Rosetta Stone to crack the code. So we know they were advanced. We just don't know what they were thinking, which makes them the mysterious honor students of early history. Fragile. Eventually, things fell apart. Again. By around 2200 BC, Mesopotamia had a problem. A really dry, dusty, crop-destroying problem. The weather went bananas. The rivers shrank. Rain stopped showing up. Farmers couldn't grow anything, and cities started to fall apart. And then someone decided it wasn't enough. He wanted to run all the cities. This was around 2300 BC, when a man named Sargon from a place called Akkad looked around and said, "Why stop at one kingdom when you can own the map?" Sargon wasn't just any leader. He was basically the first guy to create a proper empire. He started conquering the surrounding cities one by one. Uruk, Lagash, all of them. He didn't just take their land, he took their food, their people, and their loyalty. At least, that's what he claimed. He ran the Akkadian Empire like a bossy older sibling. He made sure everyone paid their taxes, respected his name, and didn't get any funny ideas about being independent. He even set up a mail system. Clay tablets were carried between cities like ancient Amazon packages. The Akkadian Empire lasted over 100 years, but, like most empires, it eventually fell apart. When the droughts came and the rivers stopped behaving, the cities got tired of being bossed around. They went back to doing their own thing. Then came another famous name, Hammurabi. He ruled Babylon around 1750 BC. And while he did plenty of empire building and conquering, he's best known for something even more dramatic, writing down the rules. See, up until then, people followed whatever rules the king shouted loudest, but Hammurabi had a different idea. He wanted everyone to know exactly what would happen if they messed up. So he gathered a huge list of laws and carved them into a giant black stone. It was massive, heavy, and meant to be seen by everyone. The stone was placed in a public space, like a town square. In other words, if you broke the law, you shouldn't say, "Oops, I didn't know." The laws were a mix. Some made sense, like punishing thieves or settling business deals. Others were a little intense. If a builder made a house and the house collapsed and killed the owner's son, then the builder's son would be killed. The code also showed something else. Society was clearly getting more complicated. There were rules for trade, farming, marriage, divorce, adoption, and even how to behave at a tavern. Yes, there were bar rules in 1750 BC. Apparently, ancient people couldn't hold their liquor. Still, the Code of Hammurabi was a big step forward. It was one of the first times in history when laws weren't just whatever the king felt like that day. They were written down, visible, and sort of followed. By the end of this chapter in history, humans weren't just growing crops and building towns. They were living under real governments, dealing with politics, taxes, and egos large enough to commission their own statues. And this was only the beginning. Empires would grow bigger, laws would get stricter, and kings would keep getting bolder, richer, and harder to ignore. The next time someone builds a city, it won't just be made of mud. It'll be made of metal, stone, money, and a whole lot of ambition. The alphabet and the Bronze Age. By now, humans were pretty far along. They had cities, they had kings, they had writing systems with way too many symbols that only a few nerdy guys could understand. But then something happened that made everything simpler, and way more useful. Someone invented the alphabet. Not hundreds of confusing pictures, not long lists of squiggles to remember which tax went where. Just a small set of letters. Each one stood for a sound. It was like inventing the shortcut to the shortcut, and it changed everything. The CAnaanites and their great idea. Let's meet the CAnaanites. They lived along the eastern ridge of the Mediterranean, mostly where Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine are today. These people were good at two things: making rich purple dye from sea snails, and sailing everywhere to sell it. Their purple cloth was so rare and expensive, only royalty could afford it. In fact, the word Phoenician, which refers to the seafaring Canaanites, comes from a Greek word meaning purple people. But their real genius wasn't fashion. It was how they made writing simple. Before them, if you wanted to write, you had to learn hundreds of Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform signs. Some were for sounds, some for whole words, and some existed just to confuse you. So the Canaanites said, what if you take just a few of these symbols and let each one stand for a sound, like B or Ka? And they did it. Around 1700 BC, they turned a mess of drawings into about 22 basic letters. Now anyone, not just elite scribes, could learn to read and write. A kid could spell their name, a merchant could write receipts, and a farmer could finally leave a passive-aggressive note about the missing goats. And just like that, knowledge started spreading, fast. Of course, when something works, other people steal it, or borrow it forever. That's exactly what happened with the alphabet. The Phoenicians, cousins of the Canaanites, were excellent sailors. They sailed across the Mediterranean and took the alphabet with them. They spread it to places like Greece, Cyprus, and Italy, where people couldn't resist tweaking it. The Greeks said, hey, this is neat, but where are the vowels? See, the early alphabets didn't write down the sounds like A, E, or O. You were just supposed to guess. The Greeks fixed that by inventing vowel letters, which made reading much easier and less like solving a puzzle. Then came the Romans. They took the Greek alphabet, changed a few shapes, and turned it into the Latin alphabet, the one you're using right now. So in short, the Canaanites made it, the Phoenicians spread it, the Greeks cleaned it up, and the Romans slapped it on every scroll, milestone, and marble wall they could find. The rest is history, literally. Because now people could finally write it down without needing 1,000 symbols and a priest's permission. And here's the coolest part. Almost every alphabet today, Arabic, Hebrew, Cyrillic, used in Russia, Greek, Latin, traces back to that original Canaanite system. The exact shapes changed, but the idea didn't. Without that tiny group of traders simplifying the chaos, we'd all still be drawing birds and eyes to say, where's dinner? Bronze Age civilizations. While letters were flying around the sea, another revolution was changing how people lived: the invention of bronze. Bronze wasn't found lying around. It had to be made by melting copper and mixing it with tin. Bronze was sharp, strong, durable, and shiny enough to make kings smile at their reflections. Around 3000 BC, this new metal took over the world. People used it to make tools, armor, weapons, statues, and even mirrors. Because if there's anything more important than winning battles, it's looking good doing it. With bronze, farmers could plow fields faster, builders could cut stronger stone, armies could fight harder. Suddenly, whoever had bronze had power. This kicked off what we now call the Bronze Age, and it lasted for about 2,000 years. During that time, civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, and the Aegean traded, fought, built, and boasted across massive distances. Goods traveled by caravan and ship, spices from India, gold from Nubia, glass beads from Mesopotamia. Even music styles and myths moved between kingdoms. In short, the Bronze Age brought more than just better tools. It created the first real global economy. It linked kingdoms together through trade and war. It gave rise to powerful rulers, standing armies, and monumental architecture. And it laid the foundation for writing systems, organized religion, and legal codes. The mysterious collapse. But then, everything fell apart. Around 12,000 BC, the world hit a wall. Cities were burned to the ground. Palaces were abandoned. Trade routes vanished. Entire empires just disappeared. Historians call this the Bronze Age collapse. And to this day, nobody fully knows why it happened. Was it drought that ruined crops? Was it earthquakes knocking down cities? Was it the Sea Peoples? By the way, it was a mysterious group of raiders who come from somewhere and cause chaos across the Mediterranean. No one knows. There's no ancient scroll that says, "Help, Sea People attacking." Just ruins, fire, and silence. Empires like the Hittites completely vanished. The Mycenaeans, or ancestors of the Greek, went dark. Egypt barely survived and never fully recovered. The Israelites and Monotheism. While the big Bronze Age empires were collapsing like a badly built Jenga tower, one small group of people in the hill country of Canaan were quietly starting something new. They weren't building giant pyramids or carving laws into stone pillars the size of buses. They were shepherds, farmers, tribe folks. Nothing fancy. But the Israelites had one thing that made them stand out. They only believed in one God. Just one. Not a pantheon, just one. Singular. No backups. Everyone else was worshipping a whole cast of characters. Egyptians had Ra, Anubis, and Horus, the falcon-headed one who always looked mildly confused. Mesopotamians had gods for rain, sun, love, war, dust, you name it. The Greeks would later have gods for everything, from wisdom to partying. But the Israelites said, no thanks, one God is enough. They called him Yahweh, and he wasn't just some local weather spirit. He created the entire universe, knew everything, and expected people to behave. No pressure. At first, this belief didn't win them many friends. The neighbors thought they were weird. Their own leaders sometimes doubted the whole thing and went back to worshipping statues made of gold. But the Israelites kept going. They wrote their laws and stories in scrolls using the alphabet so regular folks could learn them. Their God wasn't just powerful. He also had rules. 10 of them, to be exact. You've probably heard the list. Don't steal, lie, murder, or cheat. And yes, honor your parents, even when they're being impossible. And those scrolls weren't just about religion. They had detailed laws about justice, farming, holidays, and even how to treat strangers. This was the beginning of something called ethical monotheism, which means believing in one God who also wants you to be a decent human being. And here's the twist. The Israelites weren't always good at following those rules. They broke them. A lot. Their own writings later collected in what we now call the Hebrew Bible. The Bible is full of moments where they mess up, get conquered, cry out to God, and then mess up again. One of their most important stories is about Moses, a leader who helped them escape slavery in Egypt. According to their tradition, he climbed a mountain called Sinai, had a long talk with God, and came back down with stone tablets that had the 10 Commandments. Eventually, they built a kingdom. First with King Saul, then King David, and then King Solomon, who was famous for building a giant temple in Jerusalem, writing wisdom books, and having 1,000 wives. Not exactly relatable, but hey, wisdom books and temple building count for something. Solomon's temple became the center of their religion. People came to worship there, celebrate holidays, and offer sacrifices. But after his death, the kingdom split into two, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Things went downhill fast. They got conquered by the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, who destroyed the temple and exiled many Israelites to faraway lands like Babylon. This exile was horrible, but it also made their faith stronger. Being cut off from their land and temple, the Israelites didn't give up. They kept their stories, copied their laws, and built communities wherever they went. Instead of giving up on their God, they believed he was still with them, even in foreign lands. The Israelites' ideas about justice, law, and morality would eventually inspire millions, because centuries later, their teachings would evolve into something even bigger. Civilizations of the Americas. The Olmecs, the first great civilization. But first, let's meet the Olmecs, who lived around 1200 BC in what's now southern Mexico. The Olmecs were the first great civilization in the Americas. Although we don't know much about their daily lives, we do know they built huge stone heads. some as tall as houses, and carved them with amazing detail. Seriously, these heads are gigantic, each weighing several tons. They probably showed the faces of Olmec kings or important leaders. What's even more impressive is that the Olmecs moved these massive stones through thick jungles without wheels or animals like horses to help them. But here's something surprising. The Olmecs also invented a special kind of game played with a rubber ball. Teams would try to hit the ball through stone hoops without using their hands or feet. The game became incredibly popular across later civilizations. In short, the Olmecs were the mother culture, because later groups like the Maya and Aztecs borrowed many of their ideas, including their calendar and writing symbols. The Maya, masters of time and stars. Next came the Maya civilization, rising about 2,000 years ago in what's now Mexico and Central America. They lived in cities deep in thick rainforests. To build these cities, they cleared jungle trees, built temples, and created pyramids that towered above the canopy. The Maya were amazing at astronomy. Because they studied the stars so carefully, they made incredibly accurate calendars. They could even predict solar eclipses and the movements of planets like Venus. But here's the interesting part. The Maya created a unique writing system of pictures and symbols called Maya glyphs. Using this system, they recorded their history on tall stones called stelae. They wrote about kings, battles, and important dates. One of their calendars, called the Long Count, tracked time for thousands of years. Back in 2012, people talked a lot about the Maya calendar because one of its long cycles ended. Actually, the Maya never predicted doomsday. They just believed time moved in big loops. The mystery of the Maya collapse. However, around 900 AD, something strange happened. Many Maya cities were suddenly abandoned. The jungle grew back over pyramids and temples, hiding them for centuries. Historians aren't sure why this happened. One idea is that the Maya cities grew too big. They might have used up too much water and cut down too many trees. As a result, there wasn't enough food or water for everyone. People have started fighting over resources, which eventually led them to leave their cities behind. Even though their cities disappeared, the Maya didn't vanish completely. Thousands of Maya descendants still live in Mexico, Belize, and Guatemala today, speaking their own language and keeping their traditions alive. The Aztecs. Meanwhile, in central Mexico, another powerful civilization was rising. The Aztecs. Around 1300 AD, the Aztecs built their capital city, Tenochtitlan, on a swampy island in the middle of a lake. It was an incredible city, with streets, bridges, and temples built right on water. But surprisingly, the Aztecs also created floating gardens called chinampas. These were small islands built from mud, sticks, and plants, anchored to the lake bottom. On these floating farms, the Aztecs grew beans, corn, tomatoes, and even chocolate. Their city became huge, far bigger and cleaner than many European cities at the time. It might have had over 200,000 people. But the Aztecs didn't just farm. They also built a powerful empire through war and conquest. They believed their gods needed human sacrifices to keep the sun shining and the world safe. It sounds brutal today, but for the Aztecs, it was sacred economics. They gave the gods what they thought was owed. The Inca Empire. Far to the south, in what's now Peru, another amazing civilization was growing. The Inca. Their empire stretched thousands of miles along the Andes Mountains. And here's the incredible part. The Inca built their empire without horses, wheels, or even a writing system. But they did something equally impressive. They built thousands of miles of roads through some of the world's highest mountains. These roads connected their huge empire, from deserts and jungles to snowy mountaintops. Instead of writing, the Incas used knotted strings called quipus to keep track of everything. Numbers, food, taxes, and even messages. Special runners called chasquis carried messages along the roads, running up to 150 miles per day, passing quipus from one other to another. The Inca built beautiful cities too, places like Machu Picchu, hidden high in the mountains, filled with stone temples and terraces. Even today, Machu Picchu draws crowds, some for the history, some for the Instagram post. Europeans arrive and change everything. Just as these empires peaked, something showed up that would break the whole system. Europeans. In 1492, a man named Christopher Columbus sailed from Europe and reached islands near the Americas. After him, more Europeans came, bringing new animals like horses and cows, and new foods like wheat and sugar. Unfortunately, they also brought disease like smallpox. Because the people of the Americas had no immunity, millions died very quickly. Historians think diseases might have killed up to 90% of the indigenous population. While Europeans like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro came to Mexico and Peru, they found weakened empires. Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire in 1521, and Pizarro conquered the Inca in 1532. But first, how did Europeans even end up in the Americas? Let's rewind a bit. The Renaissance. Italy and the spark of the Renaissance. Let's set the scene. It's about 600 years ago, and Europe has been kind of stuck for a while. There were kings, castles, knights, and plagues. Lots of plagues. People were mostly farming, praying, and hoping not to die from spoiled soup. But suddenly, something started changing. People looked around and thought, what if we cleaned up, opened some books, and actually made the world less terrible? And that's what they did. This new era had a fancy name, the Renaissance. That word means rebirth, because Europe was basically rebooting its brain. This all started in Italy, which wasn't a country yet, just a bunch of wealthy cities like Florence, Venice, and Milan that made a lot of money from trading with Asia. They sold spices, silk, and fine cloth, and overpriced perfumes. The people who got rich from all this are merchants, bankers, and families who knew how to collect taxes with a smile. One of the most powerful families was the Medici family in Florence. They were bankers who had so much gold they basically ran the city without wearing a crown. But here's the twist. They didn't just sit on piles of coins. They used their money to pay artists, fund libraries, and hire scholars to dig up old books from ancient Greece and Rome. They basically turned Florence into a giant school, art studio, museum combo. This is where the Renaissance really took off. Not with swords, but with ideas, paintbrushes, and the occasional marble statue of a naked man. Great artists and their masterpieces. One of the most famous artists of this time was Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo wasn't just a painter. He was also an inventor, scientist, and even dreamed of flying. He filled notebooks with sketches of helicopters, submarines, and bridges. He even studied the human body carefully, drawing detailed sketches of bones and muscles. But truthfully, his paintings are what made him famous. One painting, called the Mona Lisa, is still considered one of the greatest artworks ever created. Another, The Last Supper, shows a beautiful scene filled with emotion and detail. Another incredible artist was Michelangelo. Michelangelo made a statue called David, carved from a single giant piece of marble. People said it looked so real it seemed like David might start breathing. Later, Michelangelo painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, a job that took him 4 long years. When people saw it, they couldn't believe how lifelike and powerful the images were. The printing press changes everything. Now, here's a plot twist. The Renaissance's biggest invention wasn't a sculpture or a painting. It was a machine. Before the printing press, reading a book wasn't something regular people did. Books were written by hand, literally, one letter at a time, by candlelight, usually by monks. And if they made a mistake halfway through, oops, start over. It could take months to copy a single book. A single book. That meant books were expensive. Like, only a king or a church could afford one expensive. So most people, including many kings, couldn't read. Because why bother learning to read if there's nothing to read except one dusty Bible locked in a church vault? Then along came a German goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg, who probably just wanted to save his eyes from copying stuff all day. Around 1450, he invented something that changed everything: the printing press. Gutenberg's idea was simple but brilliant. Instead of writing every word by hand, he created tiny metal letters that could be moved around to form different sentences. These were pressed onto paper using ink and a big mechanical screw. He could make a page in seconds, not weeks. He didn't invent printing. The Chinese had already done that centuries earlier. But his version was the first to spread across Europe like wildfire. His most famous print job was the Gutenberg Bible. It had 1,282 pages, and it was beautifully made. But the real magic was this: he could make hundreds of copies, all exactly the same. Once this machine got rolling, books were everywhere. Not just religious texts, but books on science, maps, medicine, farming tips, jokes, poetry, even weird advice about how to treat baldness. If someone could write it, they could now print it. So the books' prices dropped, and suddenly nerds could afford books and start arguing with people in Latin footnotes. Ideas started flying across borders faster than kings could keep up. The printing press turned Europe into one giant classroom. And the biggest surprise was it helped kick off revolutions, scientific discoveries, and even new religions. All because someone got tired of copying books the slow way. Science challenges old ideas. Thanks to all these books, people started asking more questions. And not just, why is the sky blue? But bigger stuff, like, are we really the center of the universe? For thousands of years, people thought the Earth was the center of everything. The sun, stars, planets, all of it was supposed to spin around us like we were the VIP section of space. But then came Nicholas Copernicus, a scientist from Poland. In 1543, he said, actually, I think the sun is at the center, and Earth is the one spinning. Cue the gasps. Most people didn't believe him. Some thought he was a little too sun-obsessed. But then along came Galileo Galilei, who pointed his homemade telescope at the sky and saw something wild. Moons orbiting Jupiter, not Earth, not even close. That proved Copernicus was right, and that humans weren't the center of the universe after all. It was the universe's way of saying, you're not that special. Of course, Galileo got in big trouble for saying this out loud. The church wasn't ready to give up its top spot in the solar system. He was told to stop talking, and he kind of did, but not really. Still, this new way of thinking, looking at evidence, not just beliefs, became the spark that would light the future of science. Religious changes and Reformation. Around the same time, religion in Europe was also changing. Back then, nearly all of Europe was part of the Catholic Church. It controlled almost everything: education, politics, marriage, even whether or not your soul got into heaven. If the Pope sneezed, half of Europe caught a cold. But by the 1500s, things weren't looking so holy. The church was rich, like gold palace and diamond hat rich. And some of the leaders were acting more like politicians than priests. And then came the indulgences. These were certificates people could buy that said, basically, congratulations, your sins are canceled. The more you paid, the cleaner your soul. It was like getting a golden ticket to heaven, if you had the cash. This really bothered a German monk named Martin Luther. In 1517, he wrote a long list of complaints, 95 theses, and nailed them to the door of a church in Wittenberg, Germany. Think of it as the world's first viral blog post. Thanks to the printing press, Luther's ideas were copied and spread all over Europe. Within weeks, people everywhere were asking, wait, are we allowed to question the church? Luther didn't mean to start a fight, but he did. A big one. Soon, people began forming new Christian groups called Protestants, and it's because they were protesting the church. And other new churches popped up: Lutheran, Calvinist, Anabaptist, and others. Each had different beliefs, but one thing in common: they didn't answer to the Pope. The movement was called the Reformation, and it shook Europe to the core. There were wars, there were broken alliances, there were kings switching religions just so they could divorce their wives. Yes, Henry VIII literally changed religion so he could divorce his wife. Priorities. But there was also something new: choice. Now people could read the Bible themselves in their own language and decide what they believed without needing a priest to tell them. It wasn't easy, it wasn't peaceful, but it changed religion forever. For the first time in centuries, people had the tools, thanks to the alphabet, the printing press, and a few brave thinkers, to think for themselves. And once that started, there was no going back. The birth of nations. With all these changes, countries in Europe began to grow stronger and more unified. Countries like France, Spain, England, and Portugal started forming stronger governments. Kings and queens took more control. They built armies, collected taxes, and made sure no one else was stealing their cheese or their coastline. They weren't just neighbors anymore. They were rivals. And rivals love competition. Soon, they weren't just fighting over land in Europe. They started sending ships around the world. It was the beginning of the age of exploration, when European powers decided, let's see what's out there, and take it. They sent explorers like Christopher Columbus, Ferdinand Magellan, and Vasco da Gama to find new trade routes, new lands, and new ways to get rich. They brought back gold, silver, spices, sugar, and a lot of problems. Yes, they spread ideas, languages, and technologies, but they also invaded, enslaved, and conquered millions of people. Entire civilizations like the Aztecs and Incas were wiped out. So while these new nations were growing powerful and proud, the world was becoming more connected and more chaotic. This new global map would change the future forever. But at the time, it mostly looked like a handful of European countries planting flags on places they'd never even heard of 2 weeks earlier. The age of exploration, colonization, and global empires. Europe's great explorers. By the late 1400s, Europeans were officially done guessing what was out there. They had maps, some of them terribly wrong, new sailing ships called caravels, and a growing sense of what if we just sailed until something showed up. Christopher Columbus was one of those sailors. He convinced Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain to pay for his trip west. He promised to find a shortcut to Asia, but instead, in 1492, he landed in the Bahamas, right in the middle of the Americas. He thought he had reached the Indies, which is why he called the people there Indians, even though they absolutely were not. Columbus made 4 trips across the Atlantic, and although he never realized what he'd found, he opened the door to centuries of exploration, colonization, and chaos. But Columbus wasn't alone. Ferdinand Magellan, another explorer funded by Spain, tried to sail around the entire world in 1519. Spoiler, it did not stay that way. Magellan was killed in the Philippines during a battle with locals, but one of his ships kept going and made it back to Spain in 1522. That made his crew the first to circumnavigate the globe, proving the Earth was round, way bigger than anyone thought, and covered in a whole lot of water. Then came Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese sailor who found a sea route around Africa's southern tip and reached India in 1498. He helped set up spice trading routes that made Portugal incredibly rich. They weren't subtle about it either. If trade negotiations failed, they just fired cannons until someone said yes. Very persuasive. Then they were followed with other explorers. John Cabot for England, Jacques Cartier for France, Abel Tasman for the Dutch. Every country wanted new land, new wealth, and new maps they could slap their flag on. And so the age of exploration began. The Columbian exchange changes everything. Once Columbus's ships crossed the Atlantic, they didn't just carry people. They carried life itself. Plants, animals, and diseases started crossing oceans like never before. We call this the Columbian exchange, and it rewired the entire planet. Europeans brought animals that had never been seen in the Americas, like horses, cattle, pigs, goats, and chickens. Horses were a game changer. Native American tribes like Comanche and Lakota became expert riders, using horses for hunting, travel, and even warfare. It totally transformed their way of life. But alongside animals came invisible killers. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza. These diseases spread faster than any army, wiping out entire villages in just weeks. Some historians believe up to 90% of the Native American population died within a century of European contact. It was one of the largest population crashes in history, and it wasn't even on purpose. Meanwhile, the Americas gave the world food, like a lot of it. Potatoes, tomatoes, corn, beans, squash, peppers, vanilla, and chocolate all come from the Americas. Europeans didn't just like these foods, they became obsessed. The Irish depended on potatoes so heavily that when a plant disease called potato blight struck in the 1800s, it caused a disaster. Over the next few years, more than 1 million people died of hunger, and millions more were forced to leave their homes. It was one of the darkest famines in modern European history. And yet, the impact of these crops weren't just felt in times of tragedy. They also reshaped everyday life in ways that might surprise you. Take tomatoes, for example. Can you even imagine Italian food without them? Before the Columbian exchange, pasta had no sauce, just sadness. So yeah, the exchange brought crops, animals, culture, and catastrophe, and it never really stopped. It connected continents in ways no one could undo. European empires and colonies. Europe didn't stop at exploring. That was just a warm-up. They started claiming land, and then they started conquering. Spain took the lead. They sent conquistadors and sword-waving adventurers to the Americas. Hernan Cortés defeated the powerful Aztec Empire in what's now Mexico. Francisco Pizarro crushed the Inca Empire in Peru. How? They had guns, horses, armor, and most importantly, disease. The native empires were already weakened by smallpox before most battles even began. Spain took home so much gold and silver. Their economy inflated like a balloon and popped just as fast. Portugal grabbed Brazil, plus trading posts in Africa and India. They controlled huge amounts of sugar and coffee, and soon slaves. England started colonies in North America, like Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth in 1620. Colonists came for land, freedom, and the hope of surviving winter without starving. France explored Canada, where they trapped beavers for their fur and built strong relationships with many Native American tribes, mainly because there weren't that many French settlers to fight anyone. But colonization wasn't peaceful. It meant stealing land, forcing people to work, and starting wars with local populations who were just trying to live. It also meant European countries started fighting each other across the globe. Because when land equals power, nobody wants to share. The Atlantic slave trade. Now here's the darkest part of this age. The Atlantic slave trade. When Europeans realized they could make big profits by growing sugar, tobacco, and cotton in the Americas, they needed workers. At first, they enslaved Native Americans, but most died from disease and violence. So they looked to Africa. Between the 1500s and the 1800s, an estimated 12 million African people were kidnapped, sold, and shipped across the Atlantic. This wasn't like immigration. This was forced, brutal, horrific. People were packed into ships for a journey called the Middle Passage, where there wasn't enough room to sit up. They were chained, starved, and left in filthy conditions. Thousands died before even reaching land. Those who survived were sold at auctions like property and sent to plantations, where they were forced to work under terrible conditions, often until death. The trade was supported by an entire system. European traders brought guns and goods to Africa, exchanged them for people, then shipped them to the Americas, where enslaved people were traded for sugar, rum, tobacco, and cotton, which was then brought back to Europe. It was cruel. It was massive. And it made massive profits for people who didn't care how many lives it destroyed. And yet, African culture survived. Despite everything, enslaved Africans kept their languages, music, food, and stories alive. They created entirely new cultures in Brazil, the Caribbean, and the US South. Jazz, blues, samba, gospel, gumbo, these all came from that survival. Out of unbearable suffering, new identities were born. The rise of global trade. Because of exploration and colonization, global trade exploded. Ships crossed oceans constantly, carrying tea, spices, sugar, cotton, silk, and even slaves from one continent to another. For instance, ships took European guns and cloth to Africa, traded these for enslaved people, sailed to America, and exchanged slaves for sugar and cotton. They brought these goods back to Europe, making huge profits. This system became known as the triangular trade. That's why Europe became incredibly wealthy during this time. Big cities like London, Lisbon, and Amsterdam grew into powerful trading centers, filled with merchants, banks, and ships from around the world. Conflicts and wars across continents. When there's land, money, and pride involved, peace doesn't last long. European powers, especially Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, and later the Netherlands, began fighting for control of trade routes and colonies. The result was a lot of wars, and most of them dragged in the rest of the world. The biggest was the 7 Years' War in 1756 to 1763. Think of it as World War Zero. It wasn't called that at the time, but it was fought in Europe, India, the Caribbean, the Philippines, and North America all at once. In America, it's called the French and Indian War. The British and their native allies fought the French and their native allies over land and trade. Britain won. They took Canada, parts of India, and a whole lot of pride. But war isn't cheap. To pay for it, Britain looked at its American colonies and said, hey, you guys benefited. Time to pay up. So they raised taxes on things like tea, paper, and legal documents. The colonies didn't like that at all. Seeds of revolution. And so a new idea started to grow. What if we didn't have kings anymore? In 1776, the American colonists declared independence from Britain. They wrote a dramatic letter called the Declaration of Independence. They fought a war against the most powerful empire in the world, and won, with a little help from France, of course. France saw a chance to bleed Britain's wallet and reputation, so they joined the party. This new country, the United States of America, was founded on bold ideas like freedom, liberty, equality, and voting, but mostly for land-owning white men to start. Still, it was a big shift. The American Revolution was inspirational. People in France, Haiti, Latin America, and beyond started thinking, if they can do it, maybe we can too. So the seeds of revolution began to spread. Soon the world wouldn't just be ruled by kings in shiny hats. It would be ruled by citizens, votes, constitutions, and protests. Well, sometimes. Power doesn't give up easily. But that's a story for the next time. Because next comes the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution. The power of steam. For thousands of years, people relied on wind, water, and muscle. Want to grind grain? Use a donkey. Want to weave cloth? Sit down and do it yourself. Very slowly. But the thing is, all of these had natural limits. Rivers could flood or dry up. Winds don't always blow. And no matter how strong a worker was, there was only so much they could lift or carry. So when coal mines in England started flooding in the early 1700s, people had a serious problem. The deeper they dug, the more water poured in, and buckets just weren't enough anymore. That's when Thomas Newcomen, an English blacksmith and inventor, came up with a radical idea. In 1712, he built a massive steam-powered machine to pump water out of mines. It used steam to push a piston, which then moved a large beam that lifted water to the surface. For the first time, humans had built a machine that used steam for boiled water to do hard physical labor. Even though Newcomen's engine was clunky and slow, it was a game changer. Miners could dig deeper. Coal became easier to get, and coal, in turn, would become the fuel that powered everything else. About 50 years later, in the 1760s, a Scottish engineer named James Watt looked at Newcomen's engine and saw room for improvement. Watt figured out that the machine wasted a lot of heat by constantly cooling and reheating the steam cylinder. So he redesigned it. His improved steam engine to burn coal to heat water, which made steam, which pushed pistons to power machines. Think of it as turning hot tea into muscle power. At first, steam engines were used to pump water out of mines, but soon they were powering weaving machines, metal presses, and even giant hammers in factories. Before, it took days to make a single shirt. Now machines could make 100 shirts in a single day. Faster, cheaper, and with way less effort. This changed everything. Goods became affordable. Businesses got rich, and thousands of workers moved from farms to factories just to keep up with the machines, factories, and the growth of cities. The new steam-powered machines needed big buildings to hold them, and workers to run them. That's when factories were born. Places like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool in Britain exploded in size. They went from small towns to factory cities filled with noise, smoke, and opportunity. Families left the countryside and moved to these cities for work. It was a tough trade. Yes, they got paychecks, something farms didn't offer, but they also got 14-hour days, crowded houses, and air that tasted like ash. Imagine dozens of workers stuffed into one room, surrounded by loud clanking machines, no safety guards, and windows that barely opened. One spark, one slip, or one jammed gear, and someone could lose a hand. Or worse. Children worked too. Lots of them. Kids as young as 6 worked in factories or crawled through coal mines, lighting fuses or cleaning machines because they were small enough to fit in tight spaces. Why did parents let this happen? Because they were poor, and factory owners loved cheap labor. It was brutal, but the cities kept growing. Smoke filled the sky, soot stained every brick, and the modern urban world was born. Dirty, dangerous, and unstoppable. Railways and faster travel. If steam engines changed factories, they completely transformed transportation. In 1825, a man named George Stephenson built one of the first steam-powered trains in Britain. His locomotive, called the Locomotion No. 1, looked like a rolling kettle, but it worked, and that was enough to spark a train-building frenzy. Before trains, moving goods or people across land was a nightmare. It took days to travel short distances. The roads were muddy, the horses got tired, and the wagons often broke. But trains didn't stop. They hauled coal, carried passengers, and connected cities like never before. Now, a farmer could ship vegetables across the country. A family could visit relatives in another town. A factory could sell products to people it would never have reached before. Trains shrank the map and powered the economy. Oh, and people loved trains. They were fast, they were loud, and they were cool. By the 1850s, train tracks were popping up in America, Germany, France, and India, connecting the world like never before. Inventions transformed daily life. It wasn't only factories and trains that changed the world. Other inventions transformed daily life too. For example, in 1876, an inventor named Alexander Graham Bell created the telephone. Suddenly, people could speak to someone miles away instantly. Then, in the early 1800s, investors began experimenting with electricity to create artificial light. Humphrey Davy made the first electric arc lamp, and later, inventors like Warren de la Rue and Joseph Swan made important improvements. But their designs were either too expensive or burned out too quickly. Then came Thomas Edison. In 1879, Edison introduced a version of the light bulb that was practical, long-lasting, affordable, and safe. He also built the first full electric power system to deliver light into homes and streets. In other words, technology made life simpler and more comfortable. And because ideas spread quickly, inventors continued creating amazing new products like cameras, bicycles, and even cars. Life improves, and problems emerge. Although new inventions made life easier, the Industrial Revolution had serious problems too. Factories produced tons of pollution, making cities dirty and unhealthy. Rivers filled with garbage, and the air was thick with smoke. Workers, especially women and children, worked incredibly long hours for little money. Many people got sick or injured. That's why workers began to fight for rights, demanding better working conditions, fair pay, and shorter hours. Eventually, governments passed laws improving life. They limited work hours, banned child labor, and cleaned up cities. Slowly, life got better for workers, even though it took many years and many struggles. The world becomes smaller. The Industrial Revolution didn't just affect one country. It spread across Europe and North America quickly. Soon, the United States, Germany, and France built their own factories, railways, and cities filled with machines. New technology made communication easier. Telegraph wires sent messages instantly across continents, and newspapers printed news daily. People everywhere learned about world events almost as soon as they happened. For the first time, humans felt truly connected. Events in one part of the world quickly affected others. Trade expanded, economies grew, and people traveled farther and faster than ever. Yet, even as life improved, tensions between countries grew. Powerful nations competed for wealth, colonies, and control. Soon, these tensions exploded into conflicts bigger than anyone imagined, because humans weren't done fighting. 2 enormous world wars were about to begin. World Wars and the Modern World. World War I. It all started in 1914, with a teenager, a gun, and a very bad decision. A young Serbian man shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to Austria-Hungary. Just by that, within weeks, half of Europe was at war. How? Well, countries had made alliances, basically promises to protect each other no matter what. So when Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia, Russia joined in to defend them. Then Germany joined Austria-Hungary. France backed Russia. Britain backed France. It was like a domino effect, except with bombs. Suddenly, Europe was split into two teams. Team 1, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Team 2, France, Britain, Russia, and later the United States. Because these countries had empires all over the world, battles didn't just happen in Europe. They happened in Africa, Asia, and on the oceans too. And then came the trenches. Soldiers dug long, muddy ditches across the fields of Europe. They sat there for months, freezing, starving, and getting shot at. They used poison gas, machine guns, and barbed wire. It was loud, terrifying, and barely moved an inch. Over 10 million soldiers died, many of them in trenches. Others starved, froze, or got bombed along the way. World War I became known as the Great War because it was so big and so awful, people couldn't imagine it happening again. But they were wrong. The terrible cost and a hope for peace. By 1918, the war finally ended, but the world was left in ruins. About 20 million people had died. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble, and everyone was exhausted. Leaders met in France to sign a peace deal called the Treaty of Versailles. It forced Germany to pay huge fines, give up land, and accept blame for the entire war. This made Germany furious and humiliated. Not a great combo. At the same time, leaders created the League of Nations, an international group meant to prevent future wars. Good idea. Bad execution. It had no real power, no army, and the United States didn't even join them. So yeah, not the most solid plan. Rise of dictators and the road to World War II. After the war, things got worse. Europe's economy collapsed. People were hungry, homeless, and hopeless. And when people get desperate, they'll follow anyone who promises to fix things. That's how dictators rose to power. Adolf Hitler. Hitler had fought in World War I. He came back angry, unemployed, and full of dangerous ideas. In the early 1930s, he rose to power by making promises. Jobs, order, greatness. He told Germans they'd been betrayed. He blamed Jews, communists, and outsiders for Germany's problems. His speeches were fiery, his crowds were massive, and his ideas were racist, violent, and deadly. Once in charge, he didn't waste time. He banned political parties, silenced the press, and turned Germany into a dictatorship. He built up the army, broke the Versailles rules, and nobody stopped him. Meanwhile, in Italy, another dictator, Benito Mussolini, had already taken control. He promised to bring back the glory of the Roman Empire by shouting a lot and invading places. And in Japan, military leaders started conquering parts of China, hoping to build their own Asian empire. In 1938, Hitler marched into Austria and no one stopped him. After that, he took part of Czechoslovakia. Still, no one stopped him. Finally, in 1939, he invaded Poland. That was it. Britain and France had had enough. World War II had officially begun. World War II. World War II was enormous. It involved over 60 countries, more than 100 million soldiers, and it didn't stay on one continent. In Europe, Germany's armies used a fast and brutal strategy called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It was tanks, planes, and troops that attacked hard and fast. They crushed Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, France, and more in just months. France fell quickly, and Britain refused to surrender. The British people endured months of air raids while hiding in basements while bombs flattened cities. Winston Churchill, Britain's new prime minister, told the world, "We shall never surrender." And they didn't. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, Hitler broke his promise and invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. The Germans marched deep into Russia and then froze. Literally. Russian winters are no joke. At the same time, in the Pacific, Japan had been expanding its empire, conquering parts of China and Southeast Asia. Then, in December 1941, they bombed Pearl Harbor, a U.S. naval base in Hawaii. Because of that, the United States joined the war the very next day. From that moment, World War II became truly global. Fighting happened in North Africa, the Atlantic, the Pacific Islands, Southeast Asia, and everywhere in between. There were tank battles in deserts, naval battles across oceans, and air battles over cities. For the first time, wars weren't just fought between soldiers. Entire cities were turned into battlefields. Civilians were bombed, neighborhoods became rubble, and behind enemy lines, something much worse was happening. The Holocaust. One of the most horrifying events of World War II was the Holocaust. Hitler and the Nazis tried to kill all Jewish people, as well as Roma, disabled people, and many others they hated. Millions were sent to concentration camps, where they faced unimaginable cruelty and death. By the end of the war, 6 million Jewish people had been killed. along with millions of others. The Holocaust showed the darkest side of humanity. But truthfully, it also taught an important lesson. After the war, the world promised never to let something like this happen again. But the painful truth is, it did happen again. Genocides in places like Gaza, Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur proved that hatred and violence didn't end with the Nazis. They just found new places to grow. The end of World War II and a new world. In 1945, World War II finally ended when Germany surrendered in May, and Japan surrendered in August after the United States dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet Union's sudden invasion of Manchuria. These powerful new weapons killed tens of thousands of people instantly and shocked the world. Afterwards, countries created the United Nations, a stronger organization designed to prevent future wars. After World War II, there were two countries left standing tall, the United States and the Soviet Union. And even though they fought on the same side during the war, they didn't like each other. The US believed in democracy and capitalism. The Soviets, led by Joseph Stalin, believed in communism and one-party rule. They didn't go to war directly. Instead, they entered a new kind of fight, the Cold War. This was a battle of influence, technology, military buildup, and who could scare who more with nukes. Both sides built nuclear weapons that could destroy entire cities in minutes, and they pointed them at each other and waited for decades. It wasn't just about bombs, though. It was about bragging rights, too. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first satellite, and in 1961, they sent Yuri Gagarin, the first human, into space. The US freaked out, so they pumped money into science and tech, and in 1969, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon and planted the American flag. The Cold War also led to proxy wars. It's smaller wars where each side supported opposite teams, like in Korea and Vietnam, where the US and Soviets didn't fight each other directly but backed different sides. In 1962, the world came dangerously close to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the US discovered Soviet missiles pointed at them from Cuba. For 13 terrifying days, everyone held their breath. Thankfully, leaders stepped back from the button. The Cold War wasn't hot, but it was full of chill-down-your-spine moments. Movements for freedom and equality. While superpowers were building bombs, ordinary people were building movements. After World War II, many colonies in Africa and Asia demanded independence. They were tired of being ruled by faraway kings who didn't know or care about their lives. Through protests, strikes, and sometimes wars, these countries slowly gained freedom. By 1970s, most of Africa had broken free from European rule. In the United States, the civil rights movement fought against racism and segregation. Martin Luther King gave speeches, led marches, and preached nonviolence. People sat at lunch counters, walked across bridges, and refused to accept separate but equal. Eventually, laws changed, but the fight for justice wasn't over. Women, too, demanded equal rights in voting, education, and work. They marched, wrote, and organized to be treated fairly in every part of society. Around the world, people spoke up for democracy, equality, and human dignity. Even behind the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe, brave citizens demanded freedom, knowing they might be jailed, or worse. These movements weren't always fast or easy, but they pushed the world towards something better. The end of the Cold War and a changing world. Ultimately, in 1991, the Cold War ended peacefully when the Soviet Union broke apart. The Soviet economy was in trouble. Its people were tired. Its leaders were aging and unsure. Then came Mikhail Gorbachev, who tried fixing things by giving people a little more freedom and openness. These policies were called glasnost, or transparency, and perestroika, or restructuring. But it wasn't enough. In 1989, something incredible happened. The Berlin Wall, which had divided East and West Germany for nearly 30 years, was torn down by ordinary people with hammers, hands, and hope. It felt like the Cold War was melting in real time. By 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. It split into 15 different countries, including Russia, Ukraine, and others who finally gained independence. The Cold War had ended, and this time without a warhead being launched. The world was now run by global trade, diplomacy, and a new revolution: technology. The modern age. The digital revolution. In the late 20th century, a new revolution began: the digital revolution. Computers started out huge, slow, and complicated. But by the 1980s and the 1990s, they became small and simple enough for ordinary people to use at home. Because of this, people everywhere began communicating instantly. Email replaced letters, and people shared information faster than ever before. In 1991, a scientist named Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, making it easy to find information online. Soon after, cell phones became common. These tiny devices allowed people to talk from anywhere, anytime. Later, smartphones like the iPhone appeared, changing everything again. Now, phones weren't just for talking. They became small computers we carry everywhere, letting us access the whole world instantly. Social media changes everything. Then came social media. Websites like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram connected billions of people worldwide. Suddenly, everyone could share photos, videos, ideas, and news instantly. Social media gave people new ways to express themselves. It also connected people who lived far apart. But truthfully, it also created new problems. People shared false information, causing confusion. Privacy became a big issue, as companies collected personal data about millions of people. In other words, social media was powerful, but complicated. It connected us, but it also divided us, making life both easier and more confusing at the same time. But strangely enough, this constant connection would soon shine a spotlight on something much bigger, a global crisis that we had been building for centuries, and it's finally becoming impossible to ignore: climate change and environmental challenges. Let's go back to the Industrial Revolution for a moment. Back then, factories burned coal and oil to power machines. This let humans build more, travel farther, and live longer. But it came with an invisible cost, because every time we burned fossil fuels, we released carbon dioxide into the air. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. The skies got smokier, sure, but life was getting better. But over time, the planet began to warm. Storms became stronger. Summers got hotter. Forests caught fire more easily, and droughts lasted longer. It was climate change. Now, here's the thing. Scientists have been warning about this since the 1970s, but it took decades before the leaders started listening. Because fixing it wasn't simple. It meant changing how countries made energy, how people traveled, even what they ate. Eventually, in 2015, nearly every country came together and signed the Paris Agreement, a historic promise to cut carbon emissions and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. It was a major moment. For the first time, the world agreed to act as one. But making a promise is one thing. Keeping it is much harder. Even now, countries still burn fossil fuels. Pollution continues, and the clock is ticking. That's why people all over the world have taken action. They march, strike, and demand change. Scientists develop cleaner energy. Cities plant trees, build solar panels, and try to go carbon neutral. Because climate change isn't about the future anymore. It's already here. New diseases and global pandemics. Humans also face new diseases spreading faster because of global connections. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the world, changing life completely. The virus spread quickly through air travel and infecting millions. Many countries shut down schools, workplaces, and businesses to stop it. People wore masks, stayed at home, baked questionable bread, coffee, and adapted to a new normal that nobody liked. Scientists created vaccines in record time, helping protect millions. But COVID-19 showed clearly how connected we are and how quickly problems can spread globally. It reminded humans how important global cooperation really is. Technology and artificial intelligence. Meanwhile, technology continued racing forward. Robots and artificial intelligence began doing jobs humans once did, like driving cars or working in factories. Computers learned to recognize faces, translate languages instantly, and even possibly make decisions on their own. But surprisingly, they also brought fears. People worried about losing jobs to machines, or machines making decisions without human understanding. And to be honest, no one fully knows where this is going. That's the fun and the fear. So yeah, we went from banging rocks in caves to sending memes to space. We invented fire, built pyramids, launched nukes, and now we argue with strangers on the internet using dancing cat gifs. Honestly, impressive. So what happens next? Do we colonize Mars or get distracted by cat videos for another 50 years? Do we solve climate change or just keep saying we could totally fix that while scrolling TikTok? Totally up to us, because history isn't over. It's just waiting for the next episode. So sit tight, or better yet, get up, because whether you like it or not, you're in the story now. And hey, try not to mess it up.